Good morning, everyone. My name is Valerie Edgeworth, and I'm one of the CE consultants here at the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives. And today's webinar is Murder and Mayhem, presenting the dark side of your regional history. We're really excited today about today's presentation and have two librarians here with us from the Clark County Public Library, Angela and Jennifer. And I'm going to go ahead and get the presentation ready and turn it over to them. Feel free to go ahead and type any questions you have in the chat box for today's presenters, and we will make sure to get those answered. And ladies, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, and thanks for listening to us. What better way to start your morning than to talk about murder, right? My name is Jennifer Mattern, and Angela Turner and I work at Clark County Public Library in Winchester, Kentucky. We're adult services librarians, and we handle a little bit of everything. We do local history, we do reference, as well as some adult programming. And the reason that we decided to do this presentation for the conference this year is because we wanted to share this programming idea that's been extremely successful for us. We've actually been doing it for probably, this might be our 5th year now. And it started just kind of as a fluke, something that we were both interested in, that we wanted to see if we would get good feedback on it, and it actually turned out to do really well. Both Angela and I love murder mysteries. We like true crime, sometimes the more grisly the better, and we also know that a lot of our patrons feel the same way. And if you look at what's been popular recently, you've got HBO has, well, among many others, but they just did fairly recently The Jinx, which was the documentary about the serial killer Robert Durst. Netflix has tons of them now, the Stephen Avery, The Making of a Murderer, but they have two really pretty decent ones that I've seen recently, one called The Staircase and another called Evil Genius. And obviously everything OJ, when people followed that so closely, and they're still making, TV series about him as well. And I don't know if anybody listened to the podcast Serial, but that was extremely popular, especially that first season when they talked about Adnan, who's still in the news today. So it's pretty clear that a lot of people have an interest in violence and disasters and calamity, and it's almost like a guilty pleasure for a lot of people. And it's kind of like watching a horror movie or reading a scary story, that it's kind of fun to feel afraid without really being in real danger. Angela and I guess, well, it's been over the years, we doing research for maybe genealogy or other queries, we came across some really disturbing and bizarre stories that took place here in Clark County. And, we thought, if we find this so interesting and we want to know more about it, wouldn't some of our patrons? And it turns out that they did, and they still do. And we thought, we do local history programs here fairly often, and we thought we could incorporate this into one and give it a new twist. We have a pretty extensive local history collection here at the library, and we have a lot of patrons that consider themselves local historians and history buffs. And what we do monthly, except for like in the holiday months, November and December, we have a local history program on the 4th Thursday, and we usually will schedule a speaker to come in and talk about local or Kentucky history, as well as we have a potluck beforehand. And we thought that it might be kind of fun to get away from the typical speakers that we have, like we have Chautauqua characters, local historians and authors. We have professors that come and speak. And we thought if we could tie in maybe some of these stories, that we'd still be addressing local history, but we also might appeal to a larger patron base and ones that maybe wouldn't normally come, ones that maybe don't care to hear about a story about Daniel Boone, but they would like to come for the true crime aspect. They've become really popular. We actually do 2 a year, and coming up in October, we're going to actually have our 11th one. So the interest is still there, and they're still attended well. So we're going to keep going until they tell us they don't want any more. For our first program that we ever did, we took a couple of the stories that we found in our local history room, and we fleshed them out to decide if they really were going to make a good story. We try not to be overly sensational. I mean, we want to keep to the facts, as obviously, that we have access to, and to give correct information. So we do put a lot of research into it, but it's also for entertainment. I mean, it's a program that we want people to come and enjoy and learn something, but also to keep their interest. So we ended up starting, I believe, with maybe 2 or 3 stories the first time. And on that first night, we actually had the police chief of Winchester attend, which was a surprise to us. And we had 3 people were murdered fairly recently in the county. And it was unsolved then, and it's actually still unsolved today. And because we advertised the program just simply as Clark County Murder and Mayhem, and it didn't really give a time period that we were covering, I think he thought that this unsolved murder might be part of the discussion, and he wanted to come and see what maybe would be stirred up. Needless to say, we either disappointed him or he was very relieved because we didn't touch that story at all. And that brings me to one of the important parameters we set for ourselves. And if you all decide to do something like this, you'll obviously come up with your own guidelines and rules. But we really decided we didn't want to cover any recent topics. We didn't want to step on anybody's toes. We didn't want to offend anybody. We wanted to stay away from any ongoing investigations or anything that would be sensitive to the affected family members that were still maybe in the area. And we decided that if it was a local story, and especially if it involved murder, we stick to stories that are at least 50 years old. And a lot of them are actually quite a bit older than that. And that's just a rule we set for ourselves. It's worked so far. We've not had any issues. We've not had, any patrons that have had any problems with it. And we've actually covered stories that involve a lot of our loyal patrons, some of their family, obviously generations back. But we've not had any issues sticking to this rule. Originally, we tried to do just stories that were from Clark County because we did pull them from our own local history information, and we thought the patrons would really enjoy that because they could have a personal connection, maybe to the families, the family name. They might recognize the house or the street that the people lived on, or the business it affected, or the location. But when people started wanting more and more of these presentations, we ran out of good Clark County information. So we've expanded it now, and we've considered it, I guess, a bluegrass murder and mayhem. And we try to keep it closer to our part of the state. But if the story's really good, we'll really cover any part of Kentucky. And as a matter of fact, I think the one we did last, my story was in Henderson, so it was pretty far west. And initially we were kind of concerned that if it wasn't local incidents that they'd lose interest, that they wouldn't want to come anymore, because they do like to relate to the story that, affects their hometown. But they really have enjoyed the ones in different locations just as much. We do pull from larger cities because they have more stories. They have, unfortunately, more crime. We pull a lot from Lexington and Louisville, and it turns out that our patrons are pretty familiar with those cities as well, so that's worked well for us so far. The type of stories that we choose from are varied. Our most popular is murder, but we've also covered armed robberies. We've done epidemics. We've done forgery, catastrophes, and natural disasters. And what I did is I put together some slides that go over examples of programs that we've given in the past that have done well for us. And I was just going to give a little brief background of the actual story and also why we feel like that they were successful. This first one is it was an interesting story. Thomas Massey is from Winchester, Kentucky, and his parents still lived in Winchester when this took place. It was in 1931, and he was stationed in Hawaii, and this is before Hawaii had become a state. And his wife was from a well-known, nationally well-known family, so they were in the news a lot. And she accused a group of local men from Hawaii of assaulting her. And her reputation was a little spotty to begin with, and not a lot of people believed her. But her mother-in-law and Thomas Massey ended up kidnapping and murdering one of the men that was accused of the assault. And this was a good story to present for a couple reasons. It obviously had strong Clark County ties. We had pictures of the Massey home, and people were familiar with that family, but it also had national coverage. And the reason that that's good, I mentioned that in several of these, is because it gives you a whole lot of data to pull from, and obviously a lot more pictures. You can get a lot more information. PBS did do a documentary about this murder, and that helps you if you wanted to watch it to get more information. Or it also is nice to, if you show, your patron base shows a lot of interest in the story, if you have it at the library, you can suggest that they take that home and watch for further information on the story. This also was interesting just historically because it showed a lot of the prejudice and misconceptions that the public had about people who were native to Hawaii and their relationship with people coming in from the mainland of the United States. The next one I did, this one was really interesting because a lot of our patrons, if they did know that Alberta King, she was the mother of Martin Luther King Jr., if they did realize she was assassinated, I don't know if they remembered it, and I know that they didn't remember who committed the crime. And this young man pictured is Marcus Chenault, and he is who shot and killed her in Georgia in 1974. Well, he's from Winchester, Kentucky, and I didn't know that and just came across it, and it was obviously nationally covered, but also in the local paper. They had a lot of his neighbors that were interviewed, so there were a lot of firsthand accounts that we could include. We still could go take a picture of the home where he grew up and lived, so it had strong Clark County ties, but it was something that people didn't know much about. So it was nice because it was virtually unknown to our patrons, and so they learned about an incident that they probably wouldn't have had we not covered it. The Marion Miley murder, this story was a big one, and this actually has enough information. We tried our programs to run about an hour, and this one actually could have gone at least an hour or more just on its own. She was a professional athlete. She was a golfer that lived in Lexington, and she and her mom and dad lived at the country club in Lexington. And in 1941, she and her mother, her father was out of town, were killed. And this was a huge story for Lexington. And if you see even on the left, like they did detective stories about it nationally. So it got a lot of national coverage. It also had a documentary made about the murder, so there was a lot of information there to pull from, and a lot of our people remembered it. They knew the story and that it was fairly sensational, but they didn't know the details. And what ended up making this, which surprised Angela and I both, it was a special story. We have a patron that he's in his 90s now, and he attended this program, and he's been pretty much everywhere, and he knows something about everything that you discuss. And it turns out that he actually was at the country club the night that they were killed, and he spoke to Marion Miley and shook her hand and said good night to her. And when we were talking about this, and a lot of people wanted to ask him questions, which was good interaction, it turns out that once they figured out who did commit the crimes, he admitted he knew them as, well, didn't know them, but he had met them as well and actually had drinks with them in a local bar. So it ended up turning into, we got a lot more information out of it than we expected. These were just two different, just to give you, well, one is a murder, but one was a forgery. And so we wanted to give a story. Murder is the most popular, obviously, but this was interesting just because it happened in 1890, and it was in Bourbon County, which is right next door to us. And he was from a really well-known family, so a lot of people were familiar with the family name. And at the time, for that time frame, he ended up taking away with a whole lot of money and faked his death. And so that it ended up being a really interesting story. The only downside to that being so early, we had very few visuals to go with that. As a matter of fact, that was the only picture that I ever could find of him. The second story, the gentleman at the bottom, the reason that we included this is because he is a relative of one of our good patrons. And he was is he a lawyer? He was a lawyer. He was a lawyer in town and well-known and well-connected. And he had shot and killed somebody. And his dad, I think, is that right, Angela, was a judge. Mm-hmm. So he had a lot of, I guess, legal connections. He ended up not serving time. He was found not guilty for the crime because he was defending the honor of his wife. But what was interesting about this is that our patron that comes in, he actually suggested that we do this story. So we have people that want their family to be part of the Murder and Mayhem, and he provided us with pictures that we probably would have not been able to have otherwise. And lastly, we do and have done some epidemics and disasters. As a matter of fact, the last one we did, Angela covered the 1833 cholera epidemic. And it was a nice change just to get away from murder, but also I think a lot of people knew it happened, but didn't have a whole lot of information about it. And we had a local gentleman that wrote his account of this epidemic at the time that we have at the library. So we were able to use that, and we actually could put names and faces to the story because he listed people that he knew either died or were affected by this disaster. And it was significant everywhere. Lexington got hit hard, but Winchester, I think probably 1,200 people were here around the time, and 75 of them died in this epidemic. And they actually had, a cemetery designated just for the victims of cholera. And at that time, a lot of people didn't even know where the cholera came from. So it did have a historical aspect to the story as well. We do cover, we've had several theater disasters and fires, and we did one on the Courtview Hotel fire, and it actually didn't kill very many people, which was wonderful, but you had a lot of firsthand accounts of survivors. It was a 3-story building. Most people had to exit through the windows, so they jumped out of the windows. This was in 1902. So a lot of people here, the building is no longer there. It was destroyed in that fire, didn't know that it happened, and we're familiar with some of the people that actually were personally affected from it. We do get our inspiration for stories a lot of different ways. The first ones, like I said before, from our local history files. We had people that have compiled files on crimes and murders, and we actually have some scrapbooks. So that's where we started. And after that, when we started researching a specific story that we wanted, when we're going through the newspapers, we would see headlines of another murder or something else, a disaster that happened that we thought that might make a really good idea. So we have a file that we will note like a particular name and the date so we know to go back later and see if they will flesh out to make a good story. I've also just looked for historic Kentucky murders on the internet and then gone from there to see what I could find. We have true crime books that, I think most libraries do that happen in Kentucky. We'll flip through those and see if any of them are nearby and whether there's something we might be interested in doing. We've also looked through the ghost story books because some of those are actually based on actual events. But our patrons love to give us leads. Since Angela and I started, I would say at least every month, if not more, we get patrons that come in and say, I thought of you girls. We saw this in the paper. They'll bring us a clip from the newspaper. They'll write it down. And they really, really like to kind of have that, it's like they're a part of it, especially if you end up doing one of the stories that they present to you. And just as I showed with that picture before with the gentleman, Rodney Haggard, a lot of people, you'd think you need to stay away from talking about your patrons' families, that you might step on their toes. We found just the opposite. No matter if it's shady or not, they really like to see their family mentioned, even if it is in a murder.
And in that instance, he even invited other family members to come to hear the program.
He did, and they did. Angela's going to go over the type of research we do and what kind of sources might be helpful for you if you all decide to do this in your library.
Hey, good morning. Jennifer made mention of our local history room and that we have a pretty decent collection of things in there. So we have family files, Clark County files, Kentucky files, and within the Clark County files, there is, we already had files on disasters and murders and crimes and things like that. So that was one of the first places that we went to. And then we used, and the Kentucky files were kind of the same. The family files we then used to get more background information on the people that we're looking at. We also have digital files, and you can see on there that that we've got Clark County murders on there, and that's where we are now saving our notes and things like that the research that we collect, so that you can go back, somebody else could go back and look into those murders. We also have lots of other things there that we can use. We've got the family histories, and sometimes a lot of times the things that are in the digital files are different from the things that are in the physical files. So both of those are very useful. And then we also have a photo collection. We have some patrons that have saved their family histories onto CDs and given those to us. And one family in particular donated multiple discs that have of just photos. And then we've had other people that donated things like that as well. And then with the microfilm collection, we have court order books, deeds, wills, inventories, of course the local newspapers. Within the court order books, a lot of times you will find some of the cases that went before the court, and sometimes you get like the backstory from there, because you'll see where that there have been property line disputes or other things, somebody suing somebody over something, and so you get the build up maybe to this murder through the court order books. Deeds will give you family members, and a lot of times, you then get what like boundaries were. You've got the wills and the inventories that again just locate where people were and gives you an idea of maybe where they lived in proximity to one another. And sometimes some of those things give you maybe what happened to the kids. Maybe they had, of the murdered person, maybe they had to go and live with another family because of that death. Then we also have old city directories, and they, again, are a wealth of information. You can find where the people that were involved in the crime lived. You can find where they worked, because in those old directories, not only did they list the people and where they lived, they would also list where they work, or at least what kind of work that they did. So you get a little bit of extra information about the people. And then if something had taken, the crime had taken place at a business, and maybe in the newspaper article, like with the one murder, it happened outside of the confectionery. Well, I was able to go to then the city directory and get an address, and the articles talked about then them also going over like to the pool hall or whatever. So you were able to see where everything was, and then you, just to give you some extra details, yearbooks, we have those going back to early in the 1900s, and sometimes you find pictures of the people, but even when you don't, they're a good source because of the advertisements and things. So there are so many pictures of buildings and businesses and that type of thing, where you don't just have an address, but you can actually see where people were. And then there are the Lamplighters Club essays. This group has been around for a long time, and they write up their essays, and then they present them at their club meetings, and then they have donated all of those to us. And so they write about all kinds of things. And one of the ones that I used not too long ago was when we did the cholera epidemic. We have some databases. We have an A to Z index of death and obituaries, and we have a Clark County index of the Winchester papers. This came about for us because we have a patron that, when they were researching their family, they decided that we needed to have like all of the deaths and obituaries, and he would sit at the micro reader and print off pages and pages. He did all the front pages, and then there were also things that you would find maybe other places in the paper, but he, in addition to deaths and obituaries, he did capture the stories on murder, fires, legal things, accidental deaths, I mean, all kinds of stuff. And where the newspaper itself has no index, this has been wonderful for us. But he printed all that stuff. He took it back to his office and had people that work for him to, they cut those out and taped them on individual sheets of paper, wrote the date, the name of the newspaper, and he did this over time, and then he brought them all to us. And it was big plastic tote after tote after tote of paper. And we're like, what are we going to do with this? So we talked about it, and Jennifer started then the Clark County Index. And so she would enter the name of whoever was involved, the date of the paper, which newspaper it was, and then article type. And then in notes, maybe whoever else was involved, or some kind of note about what made the story interesting. So we've been able now that we can go back and we can search by murder, or if we're looking for a disaster, we can search by disaster. And it's still a work in progress. It's not complete, but it has come a long, long way, and it is very nice to be able to have that resource.
It is. I was just going to interject that it's great for us because it helps us narrow down stories that are specific for this program, but just in general, as probably everybody knows, somebody will come in and want a story or an obituary and not have a date, and you can't search it. And this has been pretty much, in as much as we were daunted and tired from all the paperwork that he brought in, it turned out to be like probably one of our best resources, and people that come and use the library are amazed that we have it. So I would say somebody probably uses these every day, wouldn't you, Angela?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Going on from there, we have another source of information that we use a lot are the death certificates, and they tell you a lot. They tell you the cause of death, and in this case, it was strangulation by an electric cord around the neck. The person was badly beaten. It said strangled and stab wound, and then on down, it gives a little bit more, and it says that the victim had lacerations and contusions of the scalp. In addition to that, we know from here when her birthday was, that she was married, that she worked, who her parents were, the funeral home that that handled her body, and where she was buried. So you get a lot of information from there. And we do have death certificates on microfilm for Kentucky up through the 64. We try to keep up with those as soon as they release them. We try to get them. Ancestry is also a good place to find death certificates, which takes us to the databases that our library pays for that we can use. So we have Ancestry Library, Heritage Quest, Fold 3 for the military stuff, Genealogy Bank. And I'm sure most of you are pretty much familiar with these. I mean, you can find, again, the obituaries. You get the census, so you figure out where people lived and who was in the household. All kinds of things about the family. But you can also then get like the military documents, death certificates, that obits. We use newspaper databases a lot. So of course we've got the local newspaper up here, and we do use our local papers, but we use Newsbank. We have newspapers.com and Genealogy Bank that we use. They now have a clip and save option if you've not used those. So you can get the article that you want, stick it in a folder, and then come back and look at all of those. In the very beginning, we printed an awful lot of stuff, and now mostly we just save it and have a digital file as opposed to a big paper file. There's also the Chronicling America that is through the Library of Congress, which is free, and it covers years 1789 to 1963. So that's something that everybody has access to. We use a lot of maps. We show a lot of maps in our presentations. The first map, the example that's here, is of a Sanborn map, and it's marked on there, like the courthouse and what kind of establishment it is. Maybe not the exact name of the business, but it'll tell you if it was a drugstore or what, just what was in the building. The next picture is just a Google map that we all are familiar with, and then of course the street view. Up above is an aerial map, and you're able to take those and put in like the arrows that are in that picture, so that you can show where something was situated. This was in the county, and it was close to Halls on the river, and so the one arrow is pointing to Halls, and then the other to the house, to the property where the murder took place, so that you have an idea of where things are. We also have physical maps in our local history room. That's a picture of the map case in there. And the thing that makes the maps so good is that you can show people where people lived, where the murder took place. There was a mob that gathered and traveled in Winchester in one of the stories that we covered, and so was able with the maps to show the route, to show where people gathered and then the route that they traveled. And so that just is kind of interesting. And especially if you're lacking on really good just photos, the maps can help fill in there so that you have some visuals. Other sources, as Jennifer mentioned already, people tell us stories. And sometimes it is that they come in and they tell you that they have found, for the ones who are history buffs, that actually do research, they'll bring us in a date and the names, and sometimes it's a where they have printed out one article, and other people will come in and they just tell you about it. They're like, you've got to look this story up. And so we've had that, and we've covered quite a few that have been given to us. And as she said, then people are always very excited to come and hear the program when we do those, and they'll tell everybody, I told them about that. Books is another source for us, and sometimes it is a book where someone has just written a whole book about a murder. It can be something. We had a gentleman a few years ago that he had gone through the newspaper and printed out all the articles, and he just put together a binder on that murder. So sometimes you have that type of thing, and then of course you've got the books that have like lots of stories in them, and we have used those as starting points many times. And then of course, she talked about doing Google searches, and then Find a Grave. If you haven't used Find a Grave, sometimes all you find is just a name and a date, but a lot of times people have added all kinds of stuff to those records. So you get the cemetery location in it, as well as maybe their birth and death dates, but sometimes there are pictures there. The entire obituary will have been printed out, or somebody will just have typed in the story surrounding that death. A lot of times there are links to the family members, which will then also give their information as far as birth and death, and like if it was a child of somebody that had been murdered, then if it's linked, then you'll also find out who they married, and so it gives you a way to look at the family. Social media, Facebook for a lot of times finding relatives maybe. We did one story that was only, I don't know, about 35 years old, I think, but it wasn't murder. It was just an accidental. It was just a mayhem story, and I actually found where the guy ended up after he left Winchester. So that was kind of fun. And blogs, where people will write about things, and then topics. And I know you might say, oh, but that's not reliable. Well, that may be true, But if people have written about things, and a lot of times you can get names and dates and places, and it gives you, then you can go and you can look it up. I mean, I would never cite topics and say, oh, this is true, but it can give you some information that then you can look up and use. Other libraries are sources. So you can request materials from their collection. You might do an interlibrary loan, or you might call their reference department about getting copies of things. Visiting libraries if they're close. I've done that a couple of times. I've gone to, I've used Lex Pub. I've gone to Bourbon County to their library. We don't do a whole lot of that, but we do some, and so if that's a possibility for you, if you're doing your research, that's an option. We visit the cemeteries. So the picture that is here is from the Winchester Cemetery, and of course, we're 5 minutes from there. That's very handy, and we've made multiple trips there to see the headstones and to see maybe also what family was around there. In addition to that, we have gone to quite a few smaller cemeteries that are out in the county, maybe church cemeteries and things like that. So if you're able to get out and visit things, that can be fun as well as a source of information.
Don't forget, too, we did go to the dentist's office. When we were visiting properties, we actually were kind of, we weren't stalking, and we're not stalkers, but we get real interested in the places that, what happens here in Clark County, and a pretty well-known murder that happened here in a home at the time. The house is still standing, but it's a dentist's office now, and we really, there was a lot of detail given about the bedroom upstairs where the murder took place, that you could look outside and possibly see where the murderer's car was parked, and that kind of information. We both thought, boy, that'd be really cool if we could get in that house and see it. So we went and asked at the dentist's office if we could have access to it, and they did look at us like we were crazy and immediately said no. So they were not very receptive to that, but it can't hurt to try, and we did, but we were turned down, but you never know.
Okay, so what makes a good story? Details, lots and lots of details. If it's highly publicized, that means that you should be able to find not only lots of details, but also lots of pictures or graphics. Motives or possible motives, a trial where that all the facts get all fleshed out, so and hopefully you have a conviction, and then what happens with everyone. Suspects, known conflict, like I mentioned before, that sometimes it's over property, but it can be over all kinds of things.
Have a lot of adultery.
A lot, yes, absolutely. That's a big conflict. And then having local connections. Things don't have to necessarily have taken place in your community, but if there are people involved in any way, maybe they lived there prior, or had a family member, or if it's in a in a surrounding area where that people know people and know the area, so names and places and people that they're going to know. We make sure to, if it's a Winchester crime and maybe we feel like that the person involved in it might not be real well known, then we want to make sure to include where did they work, because that might be something that people would know about. Names of the attorneys, the judge, the police officers involved, the jurors, anything so that they're going to recognize something. And so then details of the family as well. Ways to wrap up. A solved case is really great, and then it's easy enough to see like where maybe people went. And while the resolution is nice, it's not necessary, but you do have to have some kind of closure. You got to have some way to wrap it up, and a lot of times that's, well, what happened to the people involved? For the ones who are living, did they stay in Winchester? If they were convicted, where did they go to? But if nobody was convicted, just what happened to the family? And so you just want to have an ending somehow. Things that may not work are if your details are too graphic or it's too shocking of a story, and you're the one who decides how detailed to make the story. We stay true to the facts. We don't embellish the story. We don't try to make it sensational. I think Jennifer mentioned that earlier. But you do want it to be entertaining. But if we think that something is too much, then we'll just maybe gloss over that particular detail. It doesn't change whether you're telling the story or not. It just, but you just have to know your audience. And there may be some people that will think that's too graphic, that's too shocking. And if they do, they won't come back to the next one. And not that you want anybody upset, but everybody's not going to like everything. But you might not want to go over the top.
And we've had that happen where we've had people come to the first one and they were nice, but it just wasn't their cup of tea. And that's good. And we'd rather people not come and be put off by it, and that by doing so many, now the people that come pretty much know what they're going to get.
If you don't have enough visuals, it makes it harder, I think, to keep the interest. People like to see things concerning, that are connected to the story. If something's too cut and dried, you need details. It needs to be a story, not Joe killed Ben. So you want something that you can tell a story about. And a lack of a hook. You've got to have something to catch that will catch their attention and hold their interest. Things to consider. When you're researching, you're going to find conflicting stories. And the older the newspapers, I think the more probably that happens. You're going to find different details, like ages and names. So one newspaper or one source may have somebody at one age, and the next one it'll be something different, and you can have probably up to 3 different ages reported for somebody, and with names. Sometimes it's a misspelling, and once they misspelled it, like they'll be true to that misspelling. Sometimes the given name is given some places and a nickname is given other places, and so you just have to, and that's where that it comes in handy to search the family a little bit so that you can figure out what the names are and what the true ages are. When searching newspapers, you want to be sure to search all the names connected to the story, or all the main names connected to the story. So whoever was the victim of the crime, you want to run their name. And if you see where that sometimes their given name was used and sometimes a nickname, then you want to search both of those. You also then want to search whoever perpetrated the crime, and any other like big name that comes up. And if you've got multiple people that either committed the crime or were affected by the crime, you want to search all their names, because when you do those searches in those newspaper databases, for whatever reason, if you search Rodney Haggard, you will get one set of results, and if you search Ben Good, you will get another set of results. Some of them, of course, overlap, but you do get different ones on each one, even though you will find both names in all of those stories. So I don't know what the criteria is that they use to determine what's going to come up in the search results, but you don't get the same thing. And so you could miss out on some really important details if you only search one name. The other thing, once you're done, run through your program and time it, probably more than once, because it always runs longer than you think that it will. And maybe it's because you think of it. Part of it could be that you think of some extra things and you throw in there that maybe you hadn't intended to say. Part of it is because people will stop and ask you questions, and so that takes some time. And then sometimes that's where some things will come to mind, maybe that you hadn't intended to include based off of the questions that are asked.
We intentionally, I guess, well, initially wanted this to be something to give suggestions for people to do at their own library. And you may have people that work there that are not very comfortable giving presentations and maybe don't know, like, don't have a special, an area of interest that they want to, present on, or that they feel like they know a lot about. And this might be a good way to get somebody involved that does like to read about true crime, and get them involved in your local history and get them more comfortable with presenting. If for any reason you're short on staff or time or resources, we had, at the presentation, we suggested that we could come to you, and that's still out there if people are interested in us traveling to your library to do a program. We've got a lot that we've already done, so if we present them at your library, we've actually already done the legwork, but they would be new to you and new to your patrons. And we're actually going to present at Jessamine County next month, and that'll be our first one that we've taken on the road. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. If you all have any questions, our emails are listed, and we'd be happy to answer any or share any information if you have a program you want to do. Like Angela said, a lot of ours we've collected in a digital file. I mean, we'd be happy to let you all have a copy of that as well. Our phone number's listed there also, and somebody had mentioned that it seems like a lot of work, and it can be. There's a fair amount of research that goes into it, and having to trim the story down to get it in your time constraints. But we are probably going to go to one a year, especially if we start to travel and do them, because there is a lot of work that goes into them. But I think you'd be surprised the feedback you get if you try it, and even maybe if you just do it, once every couple of years, just to see how your patrons react. Thank you guys very much.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you to Angela and Jennifer. This was such a wonderful presentation on a topic that is definitely getting more and more popular, and this is a great way to research and think about things that may be in our own library systems that we could start copying this program, or just invite you all to come down and help us with it. Just want to give you all a quick few reminders here, housekeeping-wise. If you didn't have a chance to download the handout or a copy of today's slides, those are available here now for you on the screen. Also, you'll see a new survey link pod there. If you click on that Murder and Mayhem, the Browse To button will go ahead and pop up, and that will lead you to a web link where you can go ahead and take today's survey. This survey information is very important for us. We always like to thank our partners, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, for their sponsorship of this webinar. Don't forget to follow us here on social media. We're both on Twitter and Facebook and post a lot of things relevant to other continuing education opportunities for you. Here's a few upcoming webinars that we have going on later this month. If you're interested in those, you can visit our CE calendar on the KDLA website to visit. And once again, thank you all for attending. And Jennifer and Angela, this is wonderful. Thank you all so much for taking time out to be with us today.
Thanks.
We'll hang out here for just a couple minutes to see if anyone else has any questions. If not, when you're ready to exit, go ahead and click the red X in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And thank you all and have a great day.